Welcome to The Debate. Today we are looking at a tragedy that has really shaken the community of Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia, and honestly the wider world.
Yeah, it's an incredibly heavy topic today.
It is. We are discussing the ethical responsibilities of artificial intelligence companies when they detect violent content on their platforms, and we'll be centering this around the attack earlier this month in Tumbler Ridge.
Right, where 8 people were killed and roughly 25 others were injured. The perpetrator was identified as 18-year-old Jessie Van Rudelaar, who took her own life following the attack.
Exactly. But the difficult question we have to face today arises from a recent disclosure made by OpenAI. The company revealed that it had actually banned an account connected to the teenager back in June, so months before the violence occurred.
And they banned it specifically because the account contained, and I quote here, talks about gun violence.
Yes. But they did not inform law enforcement at that time. So that brings us to the central question of our discussion today. When a technology company identifies content violent enough to warrant a ban, does the ethical obligation stop at simply terminating the account? Or, does it require immediate reporting to law enforcement?
It's a vital question.
I will be arguing that the identification of talks about gun violence created a clear moral imperative to report the user to authorities immediately. I really believe the threshold of clear danger, which is currently used by these companies, is just too high, and in this case it may have cost lives.
And I look at it from a different perspective. While the outcome here is undeniably tragic, I will argue that we have to distinguish between content that violates a user policy and content that signals an immediate, clear danger. Without evidence of an imminent threat, banning the account was the appropriate proportional response. Expecting software companies to function as preemptive law enforcement creates a standard of surveillance that is just not feasible.
Let's begin with the specifics of the timeline, because I think it reveals a really critical failure in the safety protocols. OpenAI confirmed they found this account in June. They identified it specifically because it broke their rules regarding violent content.
Right, that talks about gun violence.
Exactly. This wasn't a borderline case. It was a violation severe enough to trigger a permanent ban. When you have a user discussing gun violence to the extent that you feel compelled to remove them from your platform to protect your ecosystem, you are acknowledging that this user poses a real risk.
I see the link you're drawing, but I think we have to be very precise about what a risk means in a terms of service context.
But if the content is dangerous enough to be banned, I'd argue it signals a potential real-world threat. We aren't talking about a user, spamming a chat. We are talking about violence. By simply locking the digital door, OpenAI protected its own liability, but it left the community of Tumbler Ridge totally exposed. The source material notes this has raised legitimate public demand for companies to report dangerous activity more quickly.
I understand the gravity of that gap between June and February. However, I just don't buy that a digital ban equates to a prediction of mass violence. We really have to look at the distinction between policy violations and imminent threats. OpenAI's statement was very clear on this. They said that at that time, it did not see clear danger. That is the crucial phrase.
But
let me just finish this thought. Talks about gun violence is a category that can include a huge range of speech. Everything from theoretical discussions to role play to disturbing but non-actionable venting.
But 8 people are dead.
Yes, and that is horrific. Absolutely. But we are analyzing the decision made in June, based on the information available in June. If there was no specific threat, meaning no time, no place, no specific target mentioned, then removing the user from the platform was the correct enforcement action. It removes the tool from their hands. If we establish a precedent where every ban for violent content triggers a police report, we are essentially demanding that tech companies predict real-world violence from data that falls short of a criminal threat.
I am just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it relies on a definition of clear danger that seems to require a smoking gun before anyone even picks up the phone. Let's dig into this threshold. You say, talks about gun violence is broad. I argue that in the context of an 18-year-old discussing gun violence on an AI platform, the context alone should lower the threshold for reporting.
But context is highly subjective.
True, but the tragedy in Tumbler Ridge suggests that the internal assessment of what constitutes danger was deeply flawed. If the bar for clear danger is so high that it excludes a user who is eventually going to commit mass murder, then the bar is simply in the wrong place.
That is a compelling emotional argument. But have you considered the operational reality of it? We're looking at this entirely with the benefit of hindsight. Hindsight bias makes it very easy to look at that ban in June and say, aha, that was the clear sign. But in June, without a specific threat, it likely looked like just another policy violation. If OpenAI reported every user who discussed violence in a way that violated their terms, police departments would be absolutely flooded with false positives.
I would argue that when it comes to gun violence, we should tolerate a higher rate of false positives.
But at what cost? If you flood the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with thousands of reports of violent talk that never turns into action, you obscure the actual immediate threats. You dilute the resources needed to catch the people who are explicitly saying, I am going to attack this location tomorrow. That is what clear danger implies. It implies imminence. The spokesperson said they considered telling the police but decided against it because that threshold wasn't met. That shows a deliberation happened.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective on that deliberation. The fact that they thought about telling the police indicates that even they were on the fence. It was borderline. And when the stakes are potential mass casualties, the error needs to fall on the side of caution. You mentioned that flooding the police is a risk, but consider the alternative, which is what actually happened here. Silence. The police had zero chance to intervene because they had zero information. By not reporting it, OpenAI made the choice for them.
But OpenAI did take action. They banned the account. They cut off the supply of the tool.
And that brings us directly to the timeline. The account was found in June. The attack happened earlier this month. That is a span of several months. This gap was the critical window for prevention. If the police had been notified in June about a teenager discussing gun violence, an intervention could have occurred. Maybe a welfare check, a conversation with her parents. Jessie Van Rudelaar was 18, isolated perhaps. That single notification could have changed the entire trajectory.
Or it might not have. And I come at this from a structural perspective. You are placing the burden of monitoring a citizen's behavior over several months on a software company that she was no longer even using. Once they banned her in June, she was off their platform. They removed the tool. They did their part. The responsibility for monitoring a troubled teenager in the intervening months lay with local authorities, guardians, and the community.
But the community didn't know what OpenAI knew. That is the asymmetry of information we are dealing with here.
What did OpenAI actually know, though? They knew she wrote things that violated a content policy. They didn't necessarily know she was planning an attack months later. In fact, the timeline itself suggests the threat wasn't imminent in June. If she didn't attack until February, one could argue the assessment that there was no clear danger in June was technically correct. There was no immediate danger then.
That is a very legalistic interpretation of safety.
It is a precise interpretation. And safety protocols have to be built on precision, not just intuition.
But precision shouldn't paralyze prevention. You say the threat wasn't imminent. I say the ideation was clearly present. The talks about gun violence were present. We know from studying these events that they often have long lead times. Radicalization or grievance buildup takes time. This wasn't a sudden snap. It was an event by someone who had been engaging with violent themes for months. The clear danger standard seems to completely ignore the incubation period of violence.
I agree that incubation allows for intervention. I absolutely do. But I disagree that a tech company is the entity equipped to measure that incubation based on text logs alone. We have to look at the role definition here. OpenAI is a provider of a large language model. They are not a surveillance agency. Their mandate is to ensure their tool isn't misused. When they banned her, they fulfilled that mandate.
And yet, look at what happened after the tragedy. OpenAI shared information with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to help with the case.
Which is standard procedure after a crime has been committed.
But it highlights the exact contradiction I am pointing out. If that data is useful for the investigation after 8 people are dead, it was relevant data before they died. It contains the exact same information. The only difference is the body count. This reactive cooperation is insufficient. It is cleaning up the mess rather than preventing the spill.
I have to push back hard on that. That is not a contradiction. That is simply how the justice system works in a free society. Evidence becomes evidence of a crime only after a crime or a conspiracy to commit one is established. Before the attack, that data was just talk. After the attack, it provides motive or context. Police are currently checking the suspect's online and social media activity. That is proper police work. If OpenAI hands over every disturbing conversation proactively, they are fundamentally altering their relationship with users and the state.
Perhaps that relationship needs to be altered. The source text mentions that this event has started an important discussion globally. People are legitimately asking if tech companies should report dangerous activity more quickly. The status quo clearly failed the people of Tumbler Ridge.
The status quo failed, yes, but we must be very careful about where we assign the failure. The OpenAI spokesperson said they were working to improve safety and stop misuse. You might view that as an admission of guilt, but I view it as standard continuous improvement. There is a danger in assuming that because a tragedy happened, the specific breakdown occurred at the level of the AI company. It could have been a failure of mental health services or school intervention or local policing.
We can't speak to those other factors today because we are looking at the evidence regarding the AI company. And the evidence is that they held a piece of the puzzle, a very dark piece, and kept it in a drawer. You mentioned that they aren't a surveillance agency, but they are surveillance agencies in the sense that they monitor content to enforce bans. They are already watching. I am simply asking that when they see smoke, they call the fire department rather than just closing the window.
That analogy holds only if you can be certain it is smoke and not just fog. The fundamental difficulty of moderation is distinguishing between the two. Talks about gun violence is the phrase used in our source. That could be a story she was writing. It could be a recount of a news event. Without the specific transcripts, which we don't have, we have to trust that the safety team, who sees millions of these interactions daily, made a judgment call based on a lack of clear danger.
And I am saying we need to lower the threshold for what constitutes that call. If you are banning them, you have judged the content to be unacceptable. If it is unacceptable because it is violent, report it. Let the police decide if it is a creative story or a legitimate threat. The police are trained to investigate. Software engineers are not. By keeping the decision internal, OpenAI is acting as an unqualified filter for public safety.
If they act as a filter, it is because we as a society have asked them to moderate their platforms. But if we shift to your model, where unacceptable equals reportable to police, we chill free speech significantly. We create a pipeline where a violation of a corporate policy automatically leads to a police file. That is a massive, unchecked expansion of corporate and state cooperation.
When lives are at stake, privacy and procedural hurdles must yield to safety. That is my fundamental stance today. The connection between the account and the teenager was known. The violence was detected. The silence was the error. We are seeing a shift in public expectation here. The bigger questions mentioned in the source material aren't just abstract musings. They are a demand for accountability.
And I respect that demand. It is born of grief and a very natural desire to prevent this from ever happening again. But my concern is that expanding reporting requirements endlessly could have unintended consequences. It could drive troubled individuals to darker corners of the internet where there is no moderation at all and no chance of being banned or detected. At least on these platforms, there's a mechanism for removal.
But removal wasn't enough. That is the hard truth of Tumbler Ridge. Removal didn't save those 8 people.
That is true. Removal did not save them, but we cannot say with certainty that reporting would have saved them either. We are left with the ambiguity of the clear danger standard.
Let's pause on that ambiguity as we move toward our conclusion. I think we have outlined the core tension effectively today. I hold that the presence of violence in the chat logs was a sufficient red flag that required external escalation. The tragedy proves that the internal bar for danger was set too high to catch a real developing threat.
And I maintain that companies must act on evidence of immediate threats, not just broad rule breaking. Banning the account was a responsible action within the scope of the company's authority. To ask for more is to ask for a predictive capacity that simply doesn't exist yet in the tech industry.
We can agree, however, on the sheer magnitude of the loss. 8 lives lost in a small community, families destroyed, and a young woman, Jessie Van Rootlerer, who was clearly in a dark place long before she initiated this attack.
Absolutely. It is a heartbreaking event for Tumbler Ridge and for everyone involved, and it is undeniable that this event has successfully sparked an important discussion regarding the velocity of reporting. Whether we agree on the solution or not, the question of how quickly these companies report is now front and center for everyone.
It is. As AI tools become more integrated into our lives, this relationship between safety protocols and real-world law enforcement will have to evolve. It simply cannot stay where it is.
I agree. It will evolve, but hopefully it evolves in a way that balances safety with civil liberty and practical feasibility.
A difficult balance indeed. We will leave it there for today. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Thank you.